The movie begins with the sight of a man named Brian. Brian is a lonely inventor in rural Wales, and he spends his days building various contraptions that rarely work. In the narration, Brian talks about how things had gotten a bit topsy-turvy in his life, as he was busy working in a shed at night. Brian says that he loved inventing things to make himself feel better and busy in his life. He also says that the stuff he invents is not for everyone, but it made him feel good. Then, Brian goes to his strange house, and we see Plockscreen Cottage written outside on a board. Then, Brian opens the door, and we see there is a second door which is quite strange for a house. He shows off his kitchen where we see a trash bin, and Brian says that he invented this specifically for cabbages as he eats them a lot. Then he goes inside his invention's pantry and shows a pinecone bag, which is a regular tote bag with a bunch of pine cones affixed to it. After that, we see an egg belt, a leather belt featuring a few pouches in which one puts eggs. A little later, Brian is working on his lawn with a grass cutter which is barely working. Then he goes inside his barn and shows off a flying cuckoo clock. He says that whenever the villagers want to see the time, they can look up into the air and he will be there. He had never flown anything before, so he was a bit nervous, and after a few tries, he manages to start his cuckoo clock. However, as he sits on it and begins to make it fly, it catches fire. The following day, Brian goes to get some groceries, and it appears the owner of the store named June is his friend. They have a little chit-chat, and then just as Brian was about to leave, June notices something on his shoes and tells Brian that you have caught something on his shoes. To this, Brian says that these are net trawlers and he invented them. On the way, Brian sees trash on the side of the road and stops his car to go investigate it. He says that these things are like a treasure for him, and there he finds a weird mannequin head and brings it home with him. After he gets home, it seems like the lack of success doesn't seem to be bothering him to the point where he attempts by far his biggest project yet. After 3 days of work with the washing machine and spare parts, he invents a strange-looking robot. However, when he turns it on, the robot does not work. Brian tries to fix it again, but it still shows no sign of working. So, Brian gets a little disappointed, but he says when one door closes, another one opens. The next day, Brian goes out shopping, and on his way back he meets Hazel. They have an awkward conversation about the bonfire. And Hazel tells Brian that she is going to the chemist to get some medicine. After that, they both part ways. That night when Brian gets back home, it appears to be a stormy night. Then, he notices some light coming out of his shed's window, so he goes inside to see what is happening. As he goes inside, he encounters an intruder. The intruder runs away, and Brian sees his robot holding a cabbage. Then, he tried to run, but Brian tells his robot to go inside and sit, which he does. Brian then examines his invention and feels overwhelmed by it. The next morning, Brian wakes up and goes to see his robot and finds it in his house. The robot was naming everything he saw, and it appears he was learning the names from a dictionary all night. Brian then introduces himself to the robot and decides to give him a name. After some effort, they settle on Charles Petrescu, and both shake hands. After that, Charles tells Brian that they are friends, and then he continues to explore the rest of the house, naming things and stating facts. After that, Brian and Charles both go outside, and Charles feels lovely to have someone beside him, but Brian warns him that not everything in this world is lovely. Then, he decides to hide him as he knows that people might harm him, especially the Tomington family. He fears what they might do to him if they get to know him. Then, at night, Brian gets Charles ready for bed and asks Charles to turn off his blue eye light, which he cannot. The next day, Brian tells Charles that he is going out to the village, and Charles tells him that he wants to go too, but Brian refuses and tells him to stay inside. Then, Brian goes over to Hazel's house to help with some plumbing, and they both have lovely chit-chat, but suddenly Hazel's mom comes inside and gets angry. After that, Brian gets home, and we see Charles, who is very excited to see him. Brian then sees that Charles has made quite a mess of his home, and Charles apologizes for it. Then, he shows Brian a drawing he made of the two of them. As Charles grows, developing an obsession with cabbages in the process, the pair develop an interesting dynamic. Brian gets more than he bargained for, but also perhaps exactly what he needed. At night, they play darts together, and Brian boils cabbages for dinner. They were dancing together, but suddenly Charles accidentally falls off. Then, the doorbell rings and Brian asks Charles to stay quiet. Brian sees the electric man at the door, and he tells Brian that he has come for the meter reading. Brian lets him in, and after reading the meter, he tells Brian that the reading is much higher than usual. Brian says that perhaps he has started using more electricity. Then, the man notices Charles and asks him what that is, and Brian tries to distract him with his other inventions and makes him leave. Charles then gets up and feels proud of hiding himself. He then asks Brian where he learned to do everything. To this, Brian tells him that his father taught him. So, Charles asks Brian to teach him everything as well, and Brian agrees. Then, they watch TV together, and as they were watching, they see Honolulu. Charles asks Brian to go there, but he tells Charles to sit down before changing the channel. The next day, Brian again goes to the store to get some things, and he sees Eddie Tomington there, who is threatening Gene. However, Gene tries to be nice to Eddie and asks him about his bonfire. Then, Eddie turns to Brian and asks him what he is doing in the corner. To this, Brian says that he is just looking for some things, but Eddie starts throwing things at him. When Brian gets home, he looks for Charles and says that he got a present for him, but unfortunately, he could not find him anywhere. Then, Brian rushes outside and sees Charles, who is going to Honolulu. Here we see that Charles is wearing a homemade grass skirt, and Brian takes him back inside. Then, Charles goes upstairs and doesn't talk to Brian. Brian thinks that Charles has changed overnight. The next morning, Charles doesn't wake up and becomes rude to Brian even when he offers Charles to take him to the village. Then, Charles tells Brian that he can go to the village himself, but Brian says that he will only go with him or not at all. Then, after some time, he agrees to go with Brian and shows up in some funky outfits. Brian gets irritated and tells Charles that he doesn't like his new attitude. Then, they both get in the car and go to the village. When they reach there, Brian tells Charles to wait in the car while he goes into a shop. Then, Hazel comes there, and when she approaches Brian's car, she sees Charles, who introduces himself. Hazel and Charles talk a little, and then when she tells him about her parrot, Charles starts saying some random facts about parrots. Then, Brian comes there, and he begs Hazel not to tell anyone about the robot. Charles asks Brian if Hazel is coming with them to the lake, and she joins them. Then, Hazel asks Brian how he built the robot, and Brian tells her that he just used his imagination. As they were talking about Charles, they were continuously interrupted by him. Then, Hazel asks Brian to show him off to the people. After some good time together, Brian drops off Hazel at home, and before she leaves, Brian asks her to join them more often, and she agrees. Then, on the way back, Brian and Charles were discussing the dinner, and suddenly they were stopped by a tractor that was standing in their way. Then, we see Eddie's daughter, who starts noticing Charles, but the tractor moves before she could get close enough. At night, Brian calls Hazel and invites her over for the dinner. Charles then comes to Brian and tells him he is going out to get some bubblegum, but Brian refuses. After his refusal, Charles goes back to his room and gets offended. Later, when Hazel comes there, Charles starts behaving strangely. He tells them that he wants to go out and have an adventure as he does not want to stay stuck in this house. Charles then tells Brian that he does not like it when Brian is controlling him all the time and he wants to be free. Suddenly, a car pulls up and we see Eddie and his daughters come out of it. Brian begs Charles to go inside, but he refuses, and Eddie makes fun of Charles's speech. Eddie's daughters then ask Charles to dance, and he dances happily. Eddie offers Brian to buy Charles for £50, but Brian refuses and tells him that he is not for sale. Eddie then beats Brian and the girls laugh at him. Charles keeps watching everyone as they leave. At night, Brian could not sleep as Charles keeps on disturbing him throughout the night, telling him that he is dreaming. In the morning, Brian visits Hazel and she tells him that Eddie is a bully. Brian says that he felt embarrassed at her seeing her like that in front of Eddie. Then, Brian and Hazel go back home, and they discover that Brian's house has been broken into and Charles is nowhere to be found. Brian curses himself for leaving Charles alone, and they both drive off to Tomington's farm and see that Charles is dancing in front of Eddie's daughters and they were hitting him with sticks. Brian tells Hazel to wait in the car and he goes out to meet Eddie. He finds his wife Pam and she tells him that Eddie is at the cowshed. Brian goes there to meet Eddie and asks him why did he steal Charles. Eddie replies that he did not steal him as he came there on his own. Eddie then calls Charles, and when he comes to them, Brian sees that Charles is weighted down with a huge chain around his neck. Brian then begs Eddie to let him take Charles back, but he says that Charles belongs to him now. Brian then goes towards Charles and asks him if he is okay. Charles tells Brian that he wants to go home with him. Eddie's daughters then come there and tell Brian that their father will burn Charles on the bonfire. Brian gets scared and leaves with Hazel empty-handed, but Hazel tells him that he should fight for Charles. Brian then tells Hazel that he doesn't know where or how to do this. Hazel tells him to start from the beginning and use his imagination because she has never known anyone who could build a robot. Brian then sets to work, and on the night of the bonfire, all the villagers gather to see what is happening. Brian and Hazel also go there, and he says that he doesn't care if Eddie beats him up. To this, Hazel says that she cares about him and they share a kiss. Then, Eddie comes there with Charles, who is crying, and he asks who wants to see him burn. Then he puts Charles in the bonfire and lights it. However, Brian jumps to the scene and drags Charles out and brings him into his truck. Eddie notices them and starts chasing them. Then, Brian unveils his cabbage gun and Eddie starts to fire at them with the fireworks. Brian is stopped by the rest of the Bloomington family and Eddie demands Brian bring him back to the bonfire. Brian refuses to do so and Eddie pushes him, but then the villagers also come there and stand up for Brian. Brian tells them to leave and unbuttons his coat, and Eddie gets prepared to hit him, but a contraption bursts out of his coat and knocks Eddie down. Then, we see Charles, who begins to use the cabbage gun at Eddie until he leaves. The villagers congratulate Brian and Charles, and they leave with Hazel to go back home. After that, we see Charles and Brian sitting in the garden. Charles asks Brian why is he so quiet, and Brian tells him that he has a surprise for him. Then he shows Charles an around-the-world ticket. Charles asks if Brian is coming with him, but Brian says that he has everything he needs here. Then, Hazel and Brian drop him off at the train station, and Charles gives Hazel a drawing of her and Brian happy in love. Then Brian hugs Charles for the last time as he leaves for an adventure of his own. This is where the movie ends. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing videos. And thank you for watching.